Okay, so this is a B question, so you should be using your own knowledge, you should be using the sources, and you should also be trying to include the historiography, the different historians' views. So the question is, how far do you agree with the view that the USA was hit by a major economic downturn in 1929-30, because by then America no longer possessed the capacity to consume? So the first thing I'd be doing is thinking about looking at the question, and it says, how far do you agree with the view? So straight away you should be thinking, right, I need to have different viewpoints in my essay. I can't just talk about one view. I've got to have different viewpoints. It talks about the major economic downturn. Would you use that expression? It's usually the Great Depression, so you need to keep, it's a small point, but keep referring to that in your answer, major economic downturn. The date is 1929 to 30. So if you start talking about something in 1945, obviously you're not going to get marks for that, and candidates do make those mistakes sometimes, so it's really important that you stay within that date range. So do you agree with the view that the USA was hit by a major economic downturn in 1929-30, because by then America no longer possessed the capacity to consume? So a little typing error there. So obviously your answer's got to talk about the capacity to consume argument, this idea that Americans didn't have enough money, they were too poor, most Americans were very poor and they couldn't actually afford to buy more goods, and also of course markets were saturated and so on. Straight away we've learnt about in class, we've learnt a kind of a mnemonic to remember the reasons for the major economic downturn, or what we call the Great Depression, bias. So there's the banking interpretation, there's the idea that industry was responsible, there's the idea that America didn't take a world lead in international markets, there's agriculture and how that contributed, and there's the stocks and shares argument. So straight away you should be able to think, right, I can organise my answer around those different factors as well. And of course also you need to make sure you're including historians' views as well. So we've got the views of the monetarists, like Milton Friedman, and we've got views of Keynesians as well, like Badger. So they're really important to think about. And we've also got other arguments, like this idea that the Great Depression or the major economic downturn was the reason why it was caused was because of timing. We've got the Kindleberger argument that it was all to do with international America failing to take an international lead. Kennedy points to the banks, so you should be trying to include all this sort of thing in your answer. So we'll go through and we'll look at this answer now, and the first thing to think about is really the introduction. Lots of you got B's in answer to this question, so you did quite well, but I'm going to try and talk about some of the things you can do to improve to maybe get an A, which is what we're all looking for. So the first thing a lot of students aren't doing in the class is their introduction. They're not doing that as well as they could. So I'll just read through it. The major economic downturn referred to by the question was caused to a certain extent by Americans no longer having the capacity to consume. So straight away, using those key words, you want to be using the words of the question all the way through your answer, really. This essay will agree with this interpretation, but it will also point to other interpretations, such as the Keynesian interpretations. This essay will also discuss other important causes of the major economic downturn, such as the failure of America to take control and leadership of the world economy. Failures in the industrial and agricultural areas will also be discussed, but it will ultimately be argued that the most important reason for the major economic downturn was the Wall Street crash, because this led to a collapse in confidence, I should say, in the economy. The failure of America's banks due to a lack of regulation will also be discussed as the second most important contributing factor. So straight away in the introduction there, you can see, the person marking the answer has got a clear idea of what is going to be argued throughout the essay. And if you can do that in your introduction, it will get you to the higher levels, I feel, because you're telling the examiner what you're going to argue. It shows a higher level of thinking, I think. So that's really important. So the first thing I would do if I was answering this question is I'd start off by talking about the question, what's referred to in the question. So the first argument that's alluded to in the question is the capacity to consume. So deal with that interpretation first. Not all of you did that. Some of you started talking about the banks first, or started going off on some other tangent about something else. The first thing I do is address the issue of the question. So This answer starts off, and again, one viewpoint is that America was hit by a major economic downturn. So it's using these keywords like economic downturn, it's using the dates 1929 to 30, because people no longer had the capacity to consume. So straight away, you know, if you want to go back to GCSE and all that, it's going back to point, you know, starting off with a point, referring to the question. And it continues, the argument here is that, as source 7 argues, America lacked consumer purchasing power to sustain growth. So there's short little quotes from the sources there, you know, not quoting half the source, little punchy quotes. The major economic downturn was caused by Americans not receiving higher wages, and this meant they could not afford to buy new products, and it was this that led to the major economic downturn. So it's analysing the argument, it's explaining the argument. According to this interpretation, the distribution of wealth and incomes is highly skewed, and so the incomes of the top 1% of populations like farmers and others, I think that should say, was, you know, people were, only the very top had all the money, and the 99% or the 90% of Americans were very poor. And then it goes on. Effectively, historians such as Badger argue that there was no demand in the economy, and they suggested policymakers such as the government should pursue a Keynesian approach to have prevented a major economic downturn. The government should have spent more money to avoid and prevent the slide into the Great Depression. So straight away, you see that the candidate knows what they're talking about. It's talking about the Keynesian argument there, so that's really good. However, this view is contradicted by the monetarists. So again, it's bringing other interpretations into this answer. It's talking about the monetarists now, who would argue that the major economic downturn, as alluded to in the question, was actually caused not by Americans not having the capacity to consume, but by a failure to control the money supply, that should say. Monetarists such as Friedman and Schwartz suggest blame for the major economic downturn should be given to policymakers at the Federal Reserve, whose failure to control the money supply led to liquidity problems in the American economy. So the answer's clearly got a good understanding of different interpretations there. It's talked about the Keynesians, it's talked about the monetarists, and now it's moving on. So it says, next paragraph, more important than these historiographical interpretations though, is the stock market argument. So already it's gone on about the capacity to consume argument, it's talked about the Keynesians, it's talked about the monetarists, and now it's going on to this argument that the stock market was the main cause of the Great Depression, or the major economic downturn as referred to in the question. This was the most important cause of the major economic downturn, so it's referring to the question again. I disagree with source 8 that it was not decisive, so it's challenging the accepted view of a historian. I think that's really good. Admittedly, only 1% of Americans own shares, but as source 8 argues, the stock market was an indicator of the health of the economy. When the bull market turned into a bear market, it was this that caused the major economic downturn. It says Americans did not lack the capacity to consume until the stock market crashed. So it's clearly challenging the question there, isn't it? It's talking about, it wasn't the capacity to consume that was the most important reason. It's actually, a different idea. It was the stock market. It says, admittedly, the monetarist approach is persuasive, but the failure of the Federal Reserve to control the money supply did not become a major problem until the stock market crashed. So it's a challenge in these accepted interpretations, or these interpretations, the historiographical debate, and there's no reason why you shouldn't do that. You can challenge the views of historians. No one can say that you're actually wrong. They might be able to argue more persuasively than we can. They might be able to write books. There's no reason why we can't challenge their accepted views. What this answer's done is it's talked about the most important reason, in this candidate's opinion, is actually the stock market. Okay, it's saying, the stock market, the Wall Street crash was the most important reason. So it's going to order its answer, it's going to order these different factors in order of importance. It's talked about the capacity to consume argument, and then it said, well, actually, no, I think the Wall Street crash was the most important. And then it's going to go on and talk about the second most important reason now. The second most important factor in causing the economic downturn was not the capacity to consume. Again, it's referring to the question, but weaknesses in the banking system. This argument is advanced by historians such as David Kennedy, so it's got a clear, again, another interpretation being included here. By the time of the major economic downturn, this was a major problem because there were too many banks spread across America, so using its own knowledge. When one collapsed, it led to a domino effect of closures. Banks were not properly regulated, and customers' deposits were not guaranteed, and those that when the major economic downturn occurred, as caused by the stock market crash, the banks were not structurally secure, and this led to the failure of the economy. So it's using its own knowledge. This argument is much more important than the capacity to consume argument, because the banks were a vital part of the economic system, and when they collapsed, it led to a major economic downturn. So it's challenging the accepted, or the capacity to consume argument. It's challenging the question. This is the thing you've got to do. I felt a lot of you in your paragraphs, you were talking about the different interpretations, but then you weren't necessarily referring to the question and saying, well, actually, this is more important than the capacity to consume argument, and so on. The next paragraph, also an important factor, was the poor performance of sectors of the economy like farming. Farmers, despite the support of the Republican governments in the 1920s, so again, it's using its own knowledge. It knows about the policies pursued by the government towards one of their key support groups, agriculture, farmers, suffered immensely, and when they suffered, the whole of the economy suffered. Farmers experienced massive cuts in prices for their products, as source 7 suggests. The agricultural sector was doing relatively badly. So there's little quotes in there again from the sources, referring to the sources throughout. Farmers had also borrowed extensively to fund innovation and new technology, and low prices meant they could not pay back their debts. So again, it's own knowledge there. Farm foreclosures occurred at a monumental rate. Source 7 mentions that farm incomes only increased by 10% over the 1920s as a whole. So it doesn't refer back and talk about, perhaps as it should, why this was perhaps more or less important than the capacity to consume argument. Another important area of the economy that failed and contributed to economic downturn was industry. The mass production system that seemed so successful in the early 1920s had saturated markets, and there were no longer any new consumers. This led to unemployment and also links to capacity to consume. So it's linking to another interpretation there. However, timing could be viewed as being another reason for the economic downturn, not the capacity to consume. So it's challenging the question again. This view is advanced by historians such as Bernstein, so it's mentioning different historiographical interpretations again. Alright, so that's, again, very good. So next paragraph, another interpretation. So it's going on again, that different interpretation is that the economic downturn was caused not by capacity to consume. So it's linking to the argument again. But by the idea that America failed to assume the role of world economic leader. America had replaced Britain as the leader of the world, but did not do so economically. America could have done things to avoid the major economic downturn, such as devaluing the dollar. So it's using own knowledge again, isn't it? It doesn't say that in the sources. It should not have created tariffs like the Hawley-Smoot Act of 1930, against own knowledge, which had the effect of halting international trade. This view is put forward by historians such as Kindleberger. Again, another awareness of another interpretation there. In Source 8, David Goldberg supports this view as he suggests that America had narrow-minded economic policies, and this meant that this limited the foreign markets that could be tapped. So it's an awareness of different interpretations. If America had been less protectionist and had actually opened her markets and traded more, this would have prevented the economic downturn, and interpretations such as capacity to consume or the failure to control the money supply suggested by the monetarists would not have been so important. Don't know why there's a question mark at the end there. It's a bit of a typing error. But it shows an awareness of these different interpretations, doesn't it? Alright, and it's challenging these views. In conclusion, just write the question out in your conclusion. I've always said to do that. Was the major economic downturn caused by America no longer possessing the capacity to consume? If you put that, just write the question out, or a edited version of the question, it's going to lead you to focus on answering the question. Your conclusion should summarise your argument, and it should use the sources. You need to make sure you refer to each of the sources. There's 3 that we've used, and it should say what you think is the most important reason. This essay is going to talk about, well, actually, the capacity to consume argument isn't the most important, and it's going to say, and we know this from the introduction, and we know this from the structure that's been followed throughout the essay, that the stock market crash, the Wall Street crash, in this candidate's opinion, is the most important reason, followed by the banking collapse, and then the other interpretations are less important than that. So it showed a consideration of significance and importance throughout. I'll read you the conclusion. The inability of Americans to be able to buy new goods was certainly an issue that is very important, as suggested by source 7. So it's referring to that source. However, not the most important factor. So it's challenged the question, if you like. The failure of America to take a world economic lead, as suggested by source 9, it's referring to the source, is also an important factor. The monetarist argument that the Federal Reserve failed to control the money supply is also an important factor. So it's talking about all the ones, yeah, these are all important. The failure of government to create demand is also important and is suggested by the Keynesians as being very important. Failures in sectors of the economy is also important, for example, the failures of industry and agriculture. But these were all just contributing factors. Okay, it says that there. So all of this is just contributing. It's arguing the economic downturn was mainly caused by the stock market crash. So it's making a clear judgment of what the essay thinks, what the candidate thinks. This was the most important reason because although only a few Americans own shares as a proportion of the economy, that should say, the crash led to a collapse in confidence in the economy and the bubble had effectively burst. The second most important factor was the failure of the banking system, which was caused by poor regulation and a failure to guarantee customers' deposits. This led to the situation where America lacked the capacity to consume. So it's clear from this essay, I think, it's analytical throughout, it's focused on the question, it's got a clear knowledge and understanding of the latest historiographical ideas of the Keynesians, the monetarists, Kennedy's ideas that the banks were to blame, Kindleberger's ideas that actually for the failure of America to take a world lead in the world economy was a problem. The timing argument, I believe, of Bernstein, it's all discussed in there. It's used the mnemonic bias, banking, industry, the international factor suggested by Kindleberger, agriculture, stocks and shares, or the Wall Street crash. So it's discussed all of these different factors, why the major economic downturn occurred. It's talked about this idea of the capacity to consume argument, that in fact Americans didn't have enough money to spend, they lacked the capacity to consume. What it clearly does is it's got a clear introduction and it explains what the candidate will argue, and it explains that and it actually carries that out. It then goes on to talk about the capacity to consume argument, because that's what's alluded to in the question. So let's get that out of the way and talk about that in a paragraph. It then goes on to in order of importance, each factor in a different paragraph, starting with the one that the candidate thinks is the most important, the Wall Street crash, and then going down banking, and then talking about other factors as well. So what some of you aren't doing is you're not including all of the different interpretations. You might have mentioned the Keynesians or the monetarists, but you're not talking about all of them. If you're talking about all of them, I'd be more inclined to give you a B, which is what some of you got, if you've got a clear judgment and so on. But what a lot of you, or all of you, are not doing, you're not talking about what you're going to say in your essay, in your introduction. You're not explaining what you're going to argue effectively, so hopefully I've talked about that. And what you're not all doing as well is ordering your essay in order of importance. This is the most important factor, so actually I'm going to talk about this first. In my second paragraph, my second most important factor, and so on. So hopefully we can reflect on our own progress now and think about how to improve.